Philip, are you still there?
Just want to remind everyone to please select under interpretation a language. When we joined as panelists, it reset it.
All right, welcome commissioners and budget committee members. We are live on the YouTube. So Ms. Angie, I will turn it over to you to start with.
Thank you, Clerk Moss. And if you can pull up tonight's presentation. So good evening, Budget Committee members for Washington County and Service District for Lighting, number 1. We have tonight's first Budget Committee meeting for fiscal year 2022 to 2023. Next slide, please. And I'd like to introduce myself. I am your County Administrator, Tanya Angie. Next slide. And we will now have language interpretation. Thank you, Chair Harrington, Committee Member Harrington, for pointing that out. And I would now ask Victor or Philip Bransford to lead us through language interpretation instructions.
Thank you. I'll start in Spanish and then I'll go ahead in English as well. Muy bienvenidos a todos. La reunión de hoy se ofrecerá en inglés y en español. Así que tome un momento ahora para seleccionar el idioma en el que le gustaría escuchar la presentación hoy. Si se une a través de una computadora de escritorio o portátil, haga clic en el icono de globo con la leyenda Interpretation o Interpretación ubicado en la parte inferior de su pantalla de su computadora. Si está usando la aplicación de Zoom a través de un dispositivo móvil como un teléfono inteligente o tableta, presione los 3 puntos con la leyenda más o more en la parte inferior derecha o superior derecha de su pantalla y seleccione el idioma que prefiere escuchar. Si desea escuchar la reunión en inglés, seleccione inglés, o si prefiere español, seleccione español. Puede cambiar de canal en cualquier momento para escuchar la presentación en el otro idioma, pero debe seleccionar uno para escuchar todo el contenido de hoy. Si tiene alguna pregunta, alguna dificultad, por favor notifíquenos y con mucho gusto le podemos ayudar. También las diapositivas van a estar disponibles en el sitio en español, ingresando en el sitio web del condado. Ahí puede accederlos bajo la reunión de hoy. Va a haber la opción de diapositivas en español. Welcome everyone. Today's meeting will be offered in English and Spanish, so please take a moment now to select the language you would like to hear the presentation in today. If you are joining us through a desktop or laptop computer, please click the globe icon as shown on the screen. With the legend interpretation located at the bottom of your computer screen. If you're using the Zoom app through a mobile device, such as smartphone or tablet, there will be 3 dots with the legend more at the bottom right or upper right-hand side of your device. Select the language you'd like to hear. If you want to hear in English, please select English. If you prefer Spanish, please select Spanish. You can switch channels at any time or any moment during the presentation, but in order to hear all of today's content, you need to select one. If you have any difficulties, please let us know. We will do our best to help you. Also, there will be slides in Spanish, so please go to the county websites under today's meeting, and you will be given an option to access the slides in Spanish. Thank you for joining us, and we're ready.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you for your interpretation services this evening, as well as ASL. I would like to remind anyone when speaking, please speak slower so that our interpreters are able to interpret our conversation. Next slide, please. And I will turn it over to Mr. Rhodes, our interim CFO, to walk through tonight's agenda.
Thank you, Ms. Angie. I appreciate that. And before we get started on the agenda for the evening and jump into the presentation material, I just want to give a big shout out to our budget team and all of the staff members that contributed to pulling this thing together. It was a challenge this year, as Tanya will mention later on in the presentation, but a huge shout out to everyone that participated in this. And I personally would like to give a big thank you to Judy Lynn and Michael Clark for really just keeping the wheels on the bus, as I have said throughout this process, and helping us get through this challenging year. Regarding the agenda for this evening, we will start the evening with introductions of the committee. From there, we'll talk about the election of the committee chair, take care of some housekeeping with the adoption of the budget hearing procedures. And then we will jump into the meat of the discussion for the evening, and that is the budget presentation. And one thing I did want to point out this year, for each of the 4 meetings that we currently have planned, as well as the public hearings and the final budget adoption, we have allowed for time for public comment or email questions from the public to engage them as much as we possibly can through this process. Toward the latter part of the meeting, we'll talk a little bit about the next steps, and then we'll close this meeting and continue it on May 12th, which will be Thursday evening at 5:30. Next slide, please. At this time, I'd like to ask each of the budget committee members to state your name and the length of time that you have served on the committee. We'll start with our Board of Commissioners and our Chair Harrington.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Harrington, the elected at-large chair of the Washington County Board of Commissioners. I started my service on the board in January of 2019. So I am looking forward to this new and improved budget process, and am pleased to be joining you all this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Harrington. We'll move to Commissioner Fye.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes, and thank you, Chair Harrington. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nafisa Fye. I'm Commissioner-elect for District 1, Beaverton, Aloha, Cooper Mountain, and Reedville area. And this is my 2nd budget year. So happy to be here and happy to be part of this new and improved budget process.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next, Commissioner Treese.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes, and good evening to everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'm Pam Treese. I'm Commissioner for District 2, which includes Bethany, parts of Beaverton, parts of Hillsborough, Cedar Mills, Cedar Hill, Raleigh Hills, parts of Garden Home, quite a large area. So I just want to say thank you to our entire budget team for the work that you've done bringing us this budget. And I also want to thank our community for the engagement that we've had to date in this budget process. Like Chair Harrington, I've been here since 2019 and watched our budget process change and grow in a very positive way. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next will be Commissioner Rogers.
There we go. I couldn't get that off the mute. Roy Rogers. I represent District 3, which is either totally or has parts of 7 cities. So I'm mostly urban cities. I'm in the southeast quadrant. This is my 38th budget for the county I'm looking
So maybe we need to let you go through this.
Happy to.
Next up, Commissioner Willie.
I'm voting for Tanya to continue to lead that conversation. Thank you. Jerry Willie, District 4, which is basically the western side of Washington County, 5.5 cities, half of being Hillsborough. I touch 4 counties to the west and have a large portion of the urban of the rural areas as well as some urban. So thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll move to the community members now. We'll start with Mr. Maldonado.
Rodney, Mr. Maldonado is not on, but we can start with Mr. Joe Roth.
Okay, Mr. Ross.
Sorry there, just unmuting myself. Hi, yes, this is Joe Ross. I guess technically reside in District 1. This is my first budget, joined the committee in April, and really excited to learn from you all and jump on in.
Welcome. Do we have Ms. Burgart?
We do not.
Okay, how about Ms. Boland?
Go ahead, Karen.
So I'm Karen Boland. I'm a resident of Hillsborough. I own a business in Aloha. This is my 6th time going through the budget process, my 3rd term in a 2-year volunteer position. And I too have watched the budget process change, and I'm excited to see the results of this year's hard work.
Ms. Boland. And then finally, Mr. Lathrop.
He is not on, Mr. Rhodes.
Okay, all right. So moving on to the housekeeping items, Ms. Boland served as the prior chair, and we'll ask her to start the meeting and solicit nominations for the new chair. We will need a nomination and a second for the new chair. Ms. Boland?
Yes, sir. So the floor is open for nominations to lead this particular, is it's just this meeting or it's all the meetings?
All of the budget committee meetings.
Okay, for this go round.
Yes.
Okay, so the floor is open for nominations for a committee chair to lead the budget committee meetings. Are there any nominations?
I would like to nominate Ms. Boland, if you would be willing to serve again. I've been very impressed with your leadership on these committees in the past. Would you accept that nomination?
I would accept. So now we need a second to the
I'll
motion.
second it.
Seconded. Was that Catherine?
Yep.
Moved by Pam Treese and seconded that Karen Boland, I guess, continue as the chairperson for this fiscal year of the budget committee. Are there any other nominations? Hearing none, the nominations is closed. Do we want to have a vote? Is it by hand? All those in favor of Karen Boland serving as the committee chairperson for the year, raise their hand. All those opposed, same sign. I don't see anyone else, so Rodney, you'll have to give the results.
I believe that it's unanimous.
Oh.
Madam Chair.
My lucky day. Should every election be so easy?
Yes, just for the record, Madam Chair, that motion passed 7-0.
Thank you, Kevin. Kevin, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. At this time, Chair Boland, we would ask that you lead the review and adoption of the budget hearing procedures. Again, we'll need a motion in a second.
So everyone has the meeting agenda, and that's basically what we're adopting, correct? Okay, so I need a motion to adopt the committee procedures and the agenda as provided in a previous email.
So moved.
Moved by Catherine Harrington. Is there a second?
Commissioner Rogers.
Commissioner Rogers gives a second. Moved and seconded that we adopt the committee procedures for this budget process as provided in the email sent out to everyone, and I assume posted on the website for others to view. Is there any discussion? If not, let's go ahead and vote. All those in favor of the motion, raise their hand. All those opposed, same sign. I don't see the results, so you'll have to announce them.
The motion passes 7-0.
Thank you very much. Next.
Okay, as we discussed earlier, throughout the committee process, we have the committee scheduled for 4 nights. Tonight, the 12th, 16th, and 19th, starting at 5:30. This year, a little bit something different. We are encouraging all of the, we're encouraging community input during all of the budget presentations, and of course, during the public hearings and the final adoption process. So we highly encourage community input. If you have a question that you need to ask of the budget process or the budget itself, please submit it to the email on the slide, and we will compile the questions along with the answers and post those to the website as we go forward. Next slide, please. All right, so before we get started, we're going to come to each of these slides as we go through the presentation material. We'll pause for a few minutes just to see if there's any questions around or regarding the content that you've heard so far. And if not, then we will move right into the next section of the presentation. So at this time, are there any questions of the or discussion of the material that you've seen so far? Hearing none, then we will move on to our county administrator's budget message.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes, our interim CFO, and I do want to just acknowledge my appreciation, and I know the full Washington County team's appreciation for your leadership during this interim time. For the committee's information, Greg Dunn, our new CFO, will be starting with Washington County on June 1st, and we look forward to that point in time. As I provide the budget message this year, I first need to acknowledge the strained times we're all in. The proposed budget for fiscal year 2022-23 arrives as our community is emerging from over 2 years of challenges, the likes we have not seen in generations. This includes the pandemic, recession, and housing crisis. Our organization has also been under strain as we've worked tirelessly together with our partners to protect health, well-being, and a sense of civic life in our community. As an organization, we have an opportunity now to learn everything we can from our experiences and rethink our approach going forward. Part of that learning is the act of listening. This year, with the board's leadership, we have hosted 2 virtual town hall meetings focused on how we approach and prioritize the budget. In December, there were 227 participants. March, 85 participants. Thank you, board, for your leadership in guiding us through these town hall meetings. We are also supporting more opportunities for community input as part of the agenda for each budget committee meeting this year. Mr. Rhodes previously mentioned that. Another aspect of our board's leadership put in motion was the adoption of the equity resolution in February 2020. This reflected an equity-focused approach in the organization that we are taking with the budget this year. This is the inaugural year of the use of a budget equity tool, a process we have refined with partnership from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. Our Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, Latricia Tillman, We'll have more to say about the budget equity tool in a few moments. Ms. Tillman's team in the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement has done tremendous work with each department and office in our organization to launch the equity tool this year. With that said, the context for preparing the proposed budget this year has been enormously challenging for a number of reasons, due to both issues unique to our current situation and long building structural problems. As a result of these overlapping layers of challenges this year, the requested budgets put forth by our departments and offices outpaced our revenues by approximately $30 million for this upcoming fiscal year. As a reminder of the process, the requested budgets come to the County Administrative Office from departments and offices for review and analysis. Acting in my role as your budget officer, I've worked with my team in the County Administration Office, Finance, and Human Resources, along with all of our departments, to provide this committee a balanced budget proposal. The specifics about how the 30 million shortfall was addressed can be found in the budget message, and staff will speak to these measures as part of the presentations you will hear soon. Next slide, please. Allow me to walk through the proposed budget, looking at both the revenue and expenditure slides of the ledger. I'll speak to both the short-term and structural issues as we go. First, let's look at the revenue side. The single largest discretionary revenue source for the organization comes from property taxes. Like all local governments in Oregon, Washington County operates within a structure that constrains property taxes. In the 1990s, voters approved amendments to the Oregon Constitution that cut, capped, and rolled back property taxes statewide. These reforms created permanent tax rates for each taxing district. Just like it sounds, these rates are permanent. They cannot change. The assessed values that these property tax rates are applied to may only grow by 3% each year. That's 3% each year unless a property is newly developed or improved. Taxation above these permanent rates is called a local option levy and can only last for 5 years at the time if voters approve of them. As the years have gone by, Washington County and other local governments serving growing communities are now relying on local option levies more than ever to support ongoing operations. In our region, Washington County is uniquely disadvantaged within this structure, as I will show on the next slide. Next slide, please. This chart has been updated since last year with our latest population numbers. In the yellow, you can see the permanent property tax rates established in 1997 for our 3-county region. The blue dots show the percentage of population growth that has occurred since these permanent rates were established. Despite having the second largest and the fastest growing population in the region, Washington County continues to struggle to meet community need with the property tax revenue derived from the lowest permanent property tax rate. I'll talk in a moment about how this structural challenge is made even more restrictive on the expenditure side. Next slide. Another challenge we are facing on the revenue side, and I'm sorry, I'm interchanging side and slide because they're coming so close together in sentences, relates to the here and now of our pandemic response and recovery. Washington County is fortunate to have received $104.66 million in federal CARES Act funds in 2022. And we are now in the process of receiving our full $116.6 million from the American Rescue Plan Act. These one-time revenues have been critical to our COVID-19 response activities. But there is danger with attempting to meet ongoing community needs with these one-time dollars. Over-reliance on one-time revenue has the effect of masking structural problems in the county's financial approach. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about expenditures. As I mentioned during the Budget Committee's orientation last month, I've directed the organization to follow these basic principles when approaching the budget this year. Implement the budget equity tool. In this first year of implementing the tool, the proposed budget establishes baseline data and allows us to identify data gaps to focus on addressing over time. Latricia will say more about our approach in a moment. Funding essential community service levels. Washington County services are essential to the functioning of our community. This list is lengthy and includes public health, behavioral health, public safety, access to judicial services, participation in elections, collection and distribution of property tax revenue to schools, cities, special districts, and so forth. As we sought to balance the proposed budget, our goal has been to preserve the existing personnel needed to cover these core services. We are also limiting expansion of new service capacity. Continued general fund transfers. As mentioned earlier, reforms to Oregon's property tax system in the 1990s created permanent property tax rates for local governments and imposed limitations on property tax growth. When these rates were established, any temporary permanent tax levies were rolled into the permanent tax rates. Washington County had two such temporary property tax levies in effect at that time, one supporting transportation and one supporting libraries. These chosen transfers have been consistent funding to our Washington County cooperative library systems and the Major Streets Transportation Program, also known as MISTIP. The proposed budget continues this practice as has been in the past. I will note that this fiscal year, these transfers amount to a total of 17% of the total general fund expenditures. Navigating increasing inflation, supply chain problems, wage increases, higher oil prices are all contributing to an inflationary environment for next year's county budget and possibly beyond. Inflationary increases are compounded by a low interest rate environment, providing even fewer county resources to adapt and adjust to pressures. The proposed budget assumes an even-handed approach to cost of living adjustments, a 4.5 increase for both represented and non-represented employees. Our challenge will be to navigate this period of increasing prices for fuel, asphalt, and wages while staying focused on our public service mission. Minimize capital spending. Although the county has ambitious goals for supporting several areas of county operations with capital projects, the proposed budget takes a minimalist approach given our current financial environment. Next year's budget anticipates limited general fund spending on capital projects, materials, and services, or other investments that can be postponed without affecting the health or safety of county employees and the public. Within this context, the county will need to explore strategic investments in technology systems as it modernizes, such as an enterprise resources planning replacement. This is also known as a finance and human resources technology replacement. We need to navigate federal and state mandates. Our federal and state partners can pass laws or adopt rules, making local governments expand our services or meet certain requirements. But there may or may not be funding granted to us to carry out these mandates. These mandated programs, as needed as they might be by our community, are contributing to the structural challenges embedded in Washington County's current financial model for supporting community-focused services. We will outline our approach to several of these unfunded mandates as the proposed budget is presented. Funding board priorities. Finally, our board has identified multiple priorities to invest over short and long term. I've already mentioned some of these priorities, such as helping our community to recover from the pandemic and continuing with the county's equity work. Other priorities are listed in the budget message at the beginning of the proposed budget summary. Given the immediate and structural problems affecting the county at this moment, the proposed budget seeks to implement these priorities as much as possible within the limited resources available. I'll note that I, along with the staff team, look forward to revisiting our organization's community strategic plan in the next year so that we can align a long-term financial plan with that strategic plan. With that, I'll hand the presentation over to our Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, Latricia Tillman, to provide more information about the budget equity tool. Next slide.
Thank you, Ms. Angie, and good evening, Budget Committee. It's nice to see you, and I just want to start by appreciating your service with the county in this important role. So I'm going to provide a little context before I jump into the numbers that you see here on this slide. First off, I just want to reiterate, based on the county's equity resolution, the county has committed to embedding equity into all policies, programs, and practices. And of course, the budget that you are moving towards adopting is the most significant policy that gets adopted in the county every year. And along with that, just want to reiterate that equity is a priority regardless of whether we're in a lean time with a constraint budget or whether we are in a more flush time, which we hope to be in the years to come. So as a reminder, last year in the budget presentations, it was actually the budget committee that asked, so how do we embed equity into our budget conversations? And so we set about, after the passage of last year's budget, we set about establishing a budget equity tool. And some elements of that budget equity tool include data-driven decision-making, significant community engagement, which was referenced as it relates to our budget town halls, which were both focused on equity, and a review of culturally specific approaches. So we asked in the development of that budget equity tool, we asked all county organizational units, so subsets of departments, to look at their data to understand where there's inequity in access to services, quality of services, and outcomes. And then, as was mentioned earlier, to listen deeply to community about where they're seeing unmet needs or where they're appreciating the work that the county has been embarking on. And then to look at the research and other jurisdictions to see how other jurisdictions are applying culturally specific approaches to address those inequities. And so based on that, we built out a budget equity tool, and there were many submissions, I think over 100 submissions of budget equity tools that we were able to synthesize down into the numbers that we have shared with you this evening. So a couple of caveats. One, as was mentioned before, this is the inaugural budget equity tool. The budget equity tool analysis has been published on the county's budget website, so you can see that, and it is full of learnings for us to continue to improve the tool going forward, as well as many highlights of where there is quite a lot of work and investment that has already been happening within Washington County. So the good news is that as we're establishing a baseline in terms of data and investments and practices, we're not starting from scratch. There is quite a lot of work that has been happening. It's very remarkable. It's very much worth celebrating. I would say the second most important point to note here is that our budget equity tool, in our budget equity tool this year, we did not ask departments or organizational units to capture the investments that are included in personnel, whether it's a fraction of somebody's time who is working on equity programs, or whether somebody's position is full-time committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And what we know is that personnel is the most significant cost within our budget. And so the numbers that we share with you tonight are a significant under report of all the investments that Washington County has made relative to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, but I do have great news to share, and I'll lead off with the culturally specific service delivery. This dollar amount, over $21 million, represents departments requested equity investments specific to contracts that go out into community with community-based organizational partners to provide culturally specific service delivery to address known inequities in services across all of our county departments. So that's a really significant investment. Additionally, over $3 million, almost $3.5 million were proposed for investment in staff capacity building. So this includes staff training, better data systems, et cetera, focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then the third number that I want to share is that slightly over $1 million is allocated or was requested by departments for interpretation, which is the transmitting language from one language to another in a spoken way, translation, which is the translation of written documents from one language to another language, and then accommodations for people who are living with disabilities. And so slightly over $1 million was requested for that. And then finally, we asked programs to identify how many of their staff are bilingual and receive a pay differential because they use their bilingual skills at work every day. And so what we learned was that 180.5 full-time equivalent staff who are either currently working in Washington County or were requested as new positions receive that bilingual pay differential. Of course, this represents the requests from the departments, and that those requests have been modified in order to meet our budget target amount. And then now they come to you in terms of how you make your decision about the final budget. But it is really encouraging, one, the buy-in as it related to the completion of the budget equity tool. Lots of questions, lots of enthusiasm, and I'm really encouraged about the results in terms of the budget equity tool, but even more encouraged that a significant investment is being made in culturally specific service delivery and deepening our commitment to equity in Washington County. So with that, I will turn it back over, I believe, to Rodney.
Thank you, Latricia. Next slide, please. So we'll pause again to see if we have any questions about the material that has been presented so far. All right, hearing none, we'll get into the numbers. So this year's Washington County budget for FY23 is a total of $1.6 billion. The pie chart on the left of this slide represents the resources or revenues that make up the $1.6 billion that support the county operations. On the left-hand side, you can see the breakdown by our expenditure categories where the 1.6 billion goes. Next slide. As we mentioned during the orientation, we do look at our functional areas of the county. Those functional areas are more specific to particular areas such as public safety and justice, health and human resources, housing, etc. And these are the functional areas by percentage of the $1.6 billion total county budget for FY23. Next slide. Moving to the general fund budget. The general fund, again, on the left-hand side, reflects all of the revenues, and you can see that taxes make up approximately 58% of the total revenues that come in, along with other intergovernmental revenues, and then operating transfers in make the lion's share of the total general fund revenues. And as a reminder, during the orientation, we talked about the general fund. The general fund is where all of the majority of the operations and other areas are contained. And you can see on the right-hand side, the expenditures budget. The bulk of this expenditure is made up of our personnel services, over 50%. As our county administrator pointed out, this is something that is being currently reviewed in terms of personnel due to the revenue constraints that we are facing, along with other areas as well. Also wanted to point out that the expenditures this year, we have broken out the library transfer, the WCCLS, as well as the operating transfer to the MISTIT fund that Ms. Angie referred to earlier as well. Next slide. This is a slide that will depict the functional areas for the general fund. Non-operating, general government, and public safety and justice make up the bulk of all of the expenditures. This year, we wanted to provide you with a contrast of the modified FY22 budget compared to the proposed FY23 budget, the dollar amount change as well as the percent change, to give you an idea of where the ebbs and flows are between FY22 and FY23 from a functional perspective. Next slide. General funds fund balance policy. Policy 405 targets the county's fund balance requirements and reserve levels. In the general fund, we generally try to maintain a minimum of 15% and a maximum of 20% of fund balance for the general fund based on net revenues. Next slide. As we're preparing the budget and going through and doing forecasting on the general fund, we forecast out 5 years. This is a reflection of where we currently stand with our projections. As you can see in FY23, the proposed budget reflects almost the full 20%, but in 24 we dip just above the 15% threshold. And then in the out years, we're forecasting that that will begin to level off somewhat in between the 15 and 20% range. Next slide. So again, I'll pause here, ask if there are any questions regarding the total budget numbers and the comparisons that's been presented. Okay.
Rodney, do you see my
Mr.
hand?
Roden.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I do see your hand. I'm sorry.
I'll lower it and then I'll ask my question. Thank you. I'm going to ask you a pretty pointed question. You're a short timer. We know that. You've done a good job on the interim basis, so thank you for doing that as well.
Thank you.
Your projections, which I've looked at, are based upon some recovery in the outer years. If we have any recessionary period, if we have any downtick in property taxes, we can't maintain the reserves, in my opinion, at the level we're trying to project them to be at. So taking your I guess your county employee hat off and saying as a professional, should we cut deeper? And I know you're going to say that's a Tanya question, but it's not, it's to you. Should we cut deeper than the 30 million to adjust for what, in my opinion, might be a pretty rocky couple of 3 years out?
I will tell you that, and I've told Tanya and the rest of the staff this budget with the $30 million shortfall is not a one-year problem. This is an ongoing problem that's going to require the county to take a good hard look at the services provided to our citizens, what I believe what the core functions of county government are for Oregon, and any additional services that the county might look to provide and how we would provide that. So I say all that because this is a long-term issue. I think the things that will help address some of the challenges that we face, and your county administrator is setting you on the right path, quite honestly, is the creation of the strategic plan as your foundation for an agreed upon set of priorities and goals for the county. And then the execution by all of your departments that align with those strategic goals. If that is accomplished, I believe that you have the opportunity to, as I've said before, kind of right this battleship, because it's not a speedboat. You can't turn it on a dime. It's going to take time. And so I think the establishment of the strategic plan is the first step. And then beyond that, I think that aligning departmental initiatives with that strategic plan will help to direct the services where the county and the community think we should be going. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, just a very quick compliment and a follow-up question. The compliments to Tanya. I've been telling her, and she knows that, for a year and a half, that I didn't think our budget was sustainable. And to her credit, she's in there digging away saying, you're right, it wasn't. Having said that, Rodney, my other question, I'll get off of my questions for now, is that assuming a 6, 7, 8% change in direction, which it could be very easily, what could be the deficits, in your professional opinion, in years, let's say 3 and 4, assuming that our revenues we're not going to run out and get a new big tax base, because people are not going to probably vote for that. I might be wrong, but assuming revenues are constant, what sort of deficits are we looking at year 3, 4? Have you estimated?
I haven't gone in and done a lot of digging, because quite honestly, we've been focused on just trying to get this $30 million hole filled. So I haven't done a whole lot of digging. I will tell you that from my opinion, the county needs to shift focus on less reliance on one-time dollars to fund ongoing expenses. If the trend continues to use one-time dollars to fund ongoing expenses, I suspect that the county will be facing, I'm going to just say well over $10 million a year in deficits that's going to have to be made up. Any other questions? Chair Harrington.
So in my earlier positions in public government elected office at Metro, we didn't use this word deficit because as a local government, we're required to adopt balanced budgets. There is, however, the phraseology of putting reserves into action or changing fiscal policy with regard to ongoing carrying of reserves, you know, and our reserve targets. So I'm a little disheartened to hear this deficit language being thrown around because we don't have a proposed budget that's in deficit, nor do I think we would ever expect a county administrator at Washington County to propose a budget that has a structural deficit. So I would just ask that we come to a better vocabulary so we don't mislead our community. That's all.
Understood. Other questions? Yes, sir, Commissioner.
Yeah, I have to follow up with that. I don't know what else you would call it when we have a $30 million shortfall. So maybe we don't use the word deficit, we use the word shortfall. But the fact of the matter is, we had a pretty significant hole, to use Rodney's term, to fill. And so I think it's important that we also communicate a message to the constituents of Washington County that we have budget issues, and whatever terminology use, we're going to make sure we submit a balanced budget, but it's going to be painful, and that we need to be looking at other sources and opportunities so that we can put together a sustainable finance package over the next several years. So whatever we want to call it, but that's the messaging.
Well, I agree with all that you've said here, Commissioner Willie. But I think given the federal context and at the state level, they've been very clear that to really reserve that phrase of deficit for federal, because the federal government can actually function with the deficit, but here in Oregon, state and local government can't.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions before we move on? Okay. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have taken this budget presentation and broken it up into 2 nights. We've done so with the intention of giving you as much information as you need to make well-informed decisions. And so we have broken this presentation into May 9th and May 12th. So tonight and Thursday night, and then the following will be other areas of the budget that will be discussed the following week. I did want to, at this point, I did want to offer to the committee, staff has been talking internally about whether the committee would prefer to entertain the idea of one additional committee meeting night to discuss and deliberate the presentation materials that you're going to see in the next couple of weeks. We are suggesting that if the budget committee is inclined to have that third or that additional budget meeting, that we do so on May 31st at 5:30 to discuss and deliberate the budget among the committee members. And then that would be in advance of the June 1st and 2nd public hearings that would take place. So I mentioned that early on during the presentation. We'll talk about it again and look for some committee direction on that, but I wanted to kind of plant the seed early on so that as we go through the budget presentation process, everyone will have an opportunity to kind of think about that and decide whether they would like to pursue that or not. So, so tonight we will cover the general government portion, public safety and justice portion, and the land use and transportation portion of the proposed budget. And then we'll follow up with the remainder on May 12th. And then we will have the special district presentations next week, starting on Monday and Thursday. Next slide, please. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to our assistant county administrators to go through the three functional areas that I identified for this evening. Rachel Fuller will present general government and land use and transportation. Aaron Cowler will present the public safety and justice presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Fuller. Rachel.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Rhodes, and good evening to the committee. The general government functional area includes the offices of the Board of Commissioners, county administration, county council, county auditor, elections, assessment and taxation, and internal services such as HR, finance, and information technology, among others. Several general government services directly implement board priorities. These include economic development, the Office of Equity and Inclusion and Community Engagement, and COVID-19 response and recovery, which is where the organization tracks revenue and expenditures associated with the COVID-19 pandemic and associated federal funding. I'll discuss these in more detail on the next slides. You'll notice that support services shows a decrease of approximately $50 million. This is due to the budgeting of federal funds associated with the pandemic. Last year's budget included additional grant funds in emergency rental assistance, CARES funds, Oregon Health Authority, state equity funds, and FEMA funds. Next slide. The fiscal year 2022-23 budget maintains service levels across most areas of general government. However, several positions have been frozen and removed from the budget in conjunction with the county hiring freeze. These and any vacant positions will be reviewed and may be held frozen as the county monitors financial sustainability. Investments are proposed when grant and dedicated funds are available, including additional communication support for the supportive housing program and program support for grant management of federal funds. Reorganization efforts are also taking place across general government, and those are reflected in the budget narratives. And this includes the creation of standalone departments of finance and HR. Ms. Angie mentioned board priorities in her opening remarks, and board priorities are listed in the budget message. This budget funds implementation of Washington County's first economic development work plan. The goals for fiscal year 22-23 include promoting an equitable economic recovery, building a strong organizational foundation, building relationships, and seeking partnership opportunities. Federal stimulus dollars allocated to the county and to local cities are being used to stabilize businesses, reinforce business support systems, strengthen the local workforce, and develop resilient infrastructure. In fiscal year 22-23, staff will coordinate economic recovery efforts funded with federal dollars. Staff will also work with stakeholders, both internal and external to the county, to launch this new program. Included in this work is a look at engagement with county partners to help advance equitable economic recovery and understand the broad and diverse community needs, desires, and potential solutions. This budget also funds the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. This office was fully funded in the fiscal year 2021 budget and implements the policies of Washington County's Equity Resolution, which was adopted in February 2020 by the Board of County Commissioners. One of the key initiatives last year was development and implementation of the budget equity tool. You've heard about the tool in the orientation, and investments will be highlighted throughout the presentations tonight and on Thursday. As mentioned, the county is implementing comprehensive response and recovery efforts using funds from the American Rescue Plan Act. These investments include funds dedicated to public health for direct and mandated pandemic response, and for wraparound services designed to stabilize community members. Also included are investments to support small business and workforce development and economic development. Yes, next slide, please. Thank you. As mentioned, Washington County is centering racial equity in ongoing pandemic recovery efforts, including allocating funds directly to community-based organizations to help individuals access available assistance programs, including food and shelter, childcare, healthcare, general hygiene, and more. In addition, in 22-23, the county, in partnership with the cities of Hillsborough and Beaverton, will implement a shared approach to community engagement. Finally, positions in Fund 155 represent all of the actual limited duration positions that have been hired for and funded by COVID response dollars throughout the pandemic. In previous budgets, limited duration positions were included in the department budgets responsible for implementing a particular strategy or program, and these have all been moved into Fund 155, along with positions hired after approval by the Board of Tranche 1 funding allocation. This gives us greater oversight and transparency. Next slide. With that, turn it back to Rodney.
Thank you, Rachel. So back before Rachel's presentation, I neglected to ask the committee if you would like to take a 10-minute recess. If you would like to do so, we can certainly do that now before we get into the public safety and justice presentations. What's the pleasure of the committee?
I'd like to take a break, but I have a question of Rachel.
Yes, sir.
This is Roy. Hey, Rachel, you alluded to the fact that there were some adjustments between funds, and I get that. You're trying to put things in buckets and more closely match where the money's coming from. But can you, in a few words or less, describe this significant change in budget amounts that you described? You described them as ARPA money and CARES money, I think, something to that effect. But
sure. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question.
And are there positions being changed? Are we having fewer staff members, or what's changing?
Thank you for that question. The significant decrease that you see between fiscal years, I highlighted it because it is so significant. It is directly related to the budgeting of those federal funds. And because we have fewer federal funds coming in, it just shows that big decrease. Other reorganization efforts include the standing up of standalone departments, finance and HR, and staff have been moved from support services over to those departments. The other notable move in positions, if you're following it, is the move between the county auditor's office and county council. That's directly related to ensuring that staff are supervised within a different office due to the election. So those are some of the significant moves that have occurred.
Okay, other questions for Rachel? Well, it is approximately 6:35. Why don't we take a 10-minute recess? And we will reconvene at 6:45. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, are we ready to come back?
Let's make sure we give everyone their full minute left because we know starting at 5:30, people may still be eating their dinner.
Gotcha.
Commissioner Rogers, Commissioner Fye, Mr. Ross, are you back with us?
Commissioner Rogers let me know he's listening but had to be off camera for a moment. Clerk Moss.
Yes, I'm back on.
All right, back over to you, Mr. Rhodes.
Thank you. At this time, I'll turn it over to Committee Chair Boland to start us back up again.
Okay, so we're calling our meeting back to order after our break, and we're going to continue on with our presentations.
Thank
Correct?
you. Thank you so much. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Mhm.
At this time, I understand we have another committee member who's joined us. Clerk Moss, would you like to introduce?
Yes, I can. Rhodes, Mr. Paul Lathrop, are you joining us?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, I just want to give you as a new member just a moment to introduce yourself to the committee.
Well, hey, nice to meet you all. Excited to be new to this budget discussion. I have an education in accounting, but my background is in the software industry. So, probably for the next few sessions, I'm just going to be a fly on the wall and be listening in. And but it's nice to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lathrop, and back to you, Mr. Rhodes.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Calvert, our other Assistant County Administrator, to present Public Safety and Justice. Aaron?
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Next slide, please. Good evening to the Budget Committee. My name is Erin Calvert, and I'm one of the Assistant County Administrators at Washington County, and my portfolio includes the functional area of Public Safety and Justice, which is comprised of the Sheriff's Office, the District Attorney's Office, Community Corrections, Juvenile Services, Conciliation Services, Justice Court, and the Law Library. On this slide, the top left chart shows the funding sources, which include the general fund, special funds such as state and grant funding, a public safety local option levy, as well as an enhanced sheriff's patrol levy housed in district patrol. The total of all combined funds increases by 2% in this functional area. There is a decrease in total staffing of 18.75 full-time equivalent staff, which I'll talk about in more detail in the following slides. The pie chart on the right illustrates the percentage of the total budget by department, and the graph on the bottom provides the correlating dollar amount of budget. Next slide, please. The Sheriff's Office. The results of the 2020 census reduced the fiscal year 2021 forecasted population estimates for the countywide unincorporated population. This is important when thinking about the funding formula of 1 officer per 1,000 residents. For over 20 years, the general fund and the public safety local option levy have provided a service level of about 1/2 an officer per 1,000 residents in the unincorporated areas. The Enhanced Sheriff's Patrol District has made up the other half for residents living in the district. The officer per thousand service levels ensure rapid response to 911 calls, as well as being able to investigate major crimes such as homicide, burglary, sex crimes, and domestic violence. With the revised population estimates, this budget reduces 19 deputies in total, 13 in the district patrol fund and 6 in the public safety local option levy. It also recognizes a need to increase 3 deputies in the general fund to keep that officer per thousand level and all 3 funds balanced for the population. But like many things you've heard tonight on the general fund constraints, those 3 deputies are not included in this proposed budget. As it was noted during last year's budget presentation, managing the jail in the middle of a pandemic hasn't been easy. As some programs have begun to return to normal, the jail is still managing with COVID-19 protocol for congregate care facilities, and the dedicated staff have done very well to safely manage the population. Optimizing staffing levels and minimizing overtime needs continues to be challenging. The proposed budget adds 2 jail deputy positions as planned from the public safety local option levy, and will convert 2 of the reduced patrol deputies to jail deputies. The new jail healthcare contract is just being finalized after the contractor requested to terminate the current contract in January of this year. That contract was originally set to run through July of 2025. But after a request for proposal process, the new contract will result in nearly a 10% increase in cost to maintain the same level of service provided to the adults in custody. Collective bargaining is in process with the Washington County Police Officers Association, and any changes to the new contract aren't yet reflected in this budget. And then costs associated with workers' compensation claims continues to increase, though there are efforts for health and wellness initiatives that may assist in injury prevention. Next slide, please. Some additional program notes: the Mental Health Response Team, or MHRT program, that pairs a deputy with a clinician from the Mental Health Crisis Team. They've expanded services through partnerships with TriMet, as well as other interagency teams in Hillsborough and Beaverton. And then Health and Human Services is providing clinician support with law enforcement from Tigard, Tualatin, Sherwood, and King City jurisdictions. The Houseless Outreach Programs and Engagement, or HOPE Deputy program, this deputy and team work with the unhoused community, and they provide resources, monitor encampments, and act as a liaison between the sheriff's office and the community. They work with both public and private partners to address needs and safety of the unhoused community. The sheriff's office has currently absorbed the costs with the other community work they're doing. The Latino Advisory Commission continues to partner with the sheriff's office in reviewing policy, programming, and other work within the sheriff's office and community. They continue to meet monthly and continue to expand their partnership topics. As was reported in last year's budget presentation as being underway, the sheriff's office completed its independent use of force review this year. The report was shared with the Board of County Commissioners as well as the public, and the sheriff's office is working on steps to implement many of the recommendations. Much of this work will likely be integrated into their strategic plan update. Next slide, please. Moving to the district attorney's office. Each year, the district attorney's office typically reviews and processes nearly 12,000 cases, serves more than 12,500 crime victims, obtains court orders for more than $5 million in victim restitution, and collects over $35 million in child support obligations. While the numbers tell part of the story, there are other challenges currently impacting workload. There is a significant backlog of criminal cases progressing through the system, and while the total case numbers are lower, the resource needs and the workloads are greater. Digital evidence continues to increase as more and more cases involve phones, cloud storage, or other digital materials. In addition, Washington County Sheriff's Office, many other jurisdictions in lost my train of thought. Washington County Sheriff's Office and many other jurisdictions in Washington County implemented body-worn cameras over the last couple of years. However, the District Attorney's Office didn't receive any additional resources for the processing or review of evidence. This, in combination with the increase in digital evidence, has created a strain on resources. Added to that, the discovery law changes in January of this year mandated the DA's office to obtain, store, and provide evidence in cases to defense attorneys, which is a change from the prior practice where they could authorize the release of evidence. While the change in law does provide a centralized and consistent practice for discovery, the DA's office wasn't positioned in a way to handle the additional workload. The office is working toward efficiency and rebalancing of workload as best they can, which has led to some creative use of alternative funding and collaborative partnerships. Some of this includes the use of federal grant funds to establish and operate Oregon's first and only county bias hate crime multidisciplinary team. State grant funds are also being used to fund a paralegal position for the child abuse unit. And the DA's office led an effort to obtain funding through an intergovernmental agreement with the cities for a position in the Washington County Digital Forensics Lab. This will assist with the increase in digital evidence. New this year, joining the expanse of specialty courts and treatment programs is the new mental health diversion pilot program for select nonviolent offenders who are charged with qualifying misdemeanor crime where mental illness is a significant factor in the criminal behavior. The county is working with the state courts to develop ways to move through the pandemic backlog of cases without creating bottlenecks or other backlogs given the limited resources. This budget does propose 3 new FTE for the District Attorney's Office, primarily to address the unfunded mandate around discovery law and processing, as well as the workload created by the increase in digital evidence. Next slide, please. Community Corrections is responsible for providing probation, parole, post-prison supervision, and residential services in the Community Correction Center to the adult offender population. They do this through research-supported programs that facilitate effective transition of individuals into productive law-abiding lives. As we know, the funding relationship between state and county can seem complicated, but in very simplistic terms, the state is responsible for funding the supervision, sanctions, and services associated with felony cases, and the county general fund provides funding for the supervision, services, and sanctions for misdemeanor cases. The state funding levels are established by a statutorily required actual cost and time study, but even though that's mandated, the funding obligations have resulted in shortfalls over the last several fiscal years. Additionally, the felony population under supervision has decreased over the last few years, while the misdemeanor population under supervision continues to increase. This puts more pressure on the general fund. This, combined with the increased costs of inflation and workforce, requires an increase in the general fund just to maintain the current service level, which maintains the reductions that were realized in last fiscal year. Senate Bill 620 passed during the 2021 legislative session and had an impact on the community corrections revenue, where the department is no longer able to collect supervision fees from justice-involved individuals, nor those that have been referred to the collections or Department of Revenue. This new mandate on fee collection also had an impact on a DUII supervision program where the current contractor is no longer able to collect fees after providing the court with an assessment. Through a partnership with the court, the supervision is now absorbed and provided by community corrections. Next slide. As mentioned on the prior slide, community corrections made budget reductions in the current fiscal year that will continue into the next one. This includes not filling 10.5 full-time equivalent positions, most of which have been realized through vacancies. And it also reduces services and contracts by a little over $1 million. Included in these reductions are the continuation of limited beds at the Community Corrections Center. Originally reduced due to COVID-19 protocol, this budget maintains that level of service to account for a reduction in staffing and budget. If the capacity were able to be increased, this budget does not support the cost or the staffing of service needs, And this, of course, limits the number of beds in the public safety continuum. And then just to mention here that the collective bargaining is currently underway and any changes to the new contract aren't yet reflected in this budget. Next slide, please. Moving to juvenile services. The Washington County Juvenile Department contracts with Multnomah County for the use of their secured detention beds, and the cost of these beds continues to rise. This budget reflects a $150,000 increase. The Juvenile Department absorbed most of this cost by decreasing other contracts for exceeded bed space as well as other materials and services. But the rising cost for use of secure detention does highlight the need for continued planning and service delivery into the future. The Juvenile Department continues to expand their contracts and services to meet the need for culturally specific services in the community. This includes work to enhance programming by providing family navigator services, mentoring, and culturally specific behavioral health programming in the community. Additionally, and probably not surprising to anyone, the pandemic has revealed an impact to youth well-being and mental and behavioral health needs, which has created long wait lists and often high turnover in this field. This budget proposes a bilingual senior mental health specialist, which would be funded or reimbursed by the federal Title IV funds. And then this proposed budget continues a new diversion program that was funded by local option levy dollars and awarded through a request for proposal process to Latino Network. This program will work by referring low-level first-time offenders to services which include assessment and then culturally specific risk-based services that would prevent further involvement in the juvenile justice system. Next slide. Conciliation Services operates as an arm of the Juvenile Department and provides custody services to the circuit court when children are subjects of domestic relations conflicts. Counseling is provided to individuals for issues concerning marriage or divorce, and mediation services are offered to parties in the process of a divorce or separation to help determine custody. Conciliation is funded by the state through the Oregon Judicial Department, and the funding has not increased in more than a decade, despite the increase in the cost of providing service. This program operates with just 4 FTE. The statute allows for some funds allocated from the Oregon Judicial Department to the Law Library to be diverted to conciliation services, as determined by the Board of County Commissioners. In 2012, the Board of County Commissioners implemented a funding formula to assist conciliation to maintain their current service level, while the Law Library spent down some of their fund balance. However, in 2019, the board temporarily halted this funding formula in order to evaluate the state funding to both the conciliation and Law Library programs, neither of which has increased. And then recently, the board determined that each program would continue to budget with their state appropriation as more work is done to try to increase state funding. Conciliation provides critical services to a growing Washington County, and there is concern that the current service level will not continue without an increase in state funding. Next slide. Law Library. The Law Library strives to enhance equal access to justice by ensuring legal information, resources, and tools are available and accessible to everyone. They do this with just 3 FTE staffed Monday through Friday during regular business hours. The Law Library is governed by the Washington County Board of Commissioners in consultation with the Circuit Court Presiding Judge and advised by the Washington County Bar Association's Law Library Committee. The Law Library, which is also funded by the state, with funds allocated from the Oregon Judicial Department, also hasn't increased in over a decade, and in fact experienced a decrease in funding 2 years ago. As with conciliation, maintaining or decreasing funding puts even more strain on the current staffing and service levels. Due to the funding formula that I just mentioned that had been in place for a number of years, the Law Library's fund balance has been drawn down to a point that without an increase in state funding, current service and staffing levels will likely be impacted. Next slide, please. The Washington County Justice Court is the only court administered by the county, and it provides services in connection with civil and criminal actions. The court is administered by an elected justice of the peace. The Justice Court has jurisdiction over most violations of the State Motor Vehicle Code, certain misdemeanor offenses, as well as civil claims for money and damages not to exceed $10,000. The overall number of citations filed with the Justice Court has continued to decline each year. While COVID-19 has impacted the ability to conduct small claims trials, there has been some use of virtual hearings, but overall there has been less adjudications over the life of the pandemic. An increase in filings is anticipated as the court begins to resume more in-person trials. The good news is the Justice Court isn't experiencing the same kind of case backlog that the Circuit Court is experiencing. Next slide, please. I wanted to spend a few minutes on some of the equity investments from the Public Safety and Justice Departments. But given time, I would invite you to review the budget equity analysis that Ms. Tillman mentioned at the beginning of the presentation today. But just some very high level efforts and investments that the departments are making all have made some level of translation and interpretation and accommodation services in all of the departments. The Sheriff's Office continues to create presentations, videos, outreach, and social media in Spanish. At the jail, volunteer clergy provide religious services for many of the common religions. And jail housing also accommodates special meals for medical and religious purposes. Jail intake also has protocols for transgender and non-binary adults in custody to determine housing assignments. And there's a process for gender non-conforming adults in custody before lodging them in the general population. For the DA's office this year, they launched the only county-based bias and hate crime multidisciplinary team after receiving a federal grant to address the increase in bias crime referrals between 2018 and 2020. There's been extensive community outreach to encourage reporting and community and system response when they occur. The Juvenile Department continues to invest in culturally specific contracts with providers and continues to address the needs of Latinx and BIPOC youth where they are overrepresented at various decision points in the system and in secure detention. Community Corrections is collecting data and tracking sanctions by race and ethnicity and plan to work with partner agencies and communities of color to address the disparities. And then as mentioned, the smaller departments of Justice Court, Law Library, and Conciliation Services also include investments for interpretation and translation services. Next slide, please. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So I have a question. When you talk about the grants, do we reapply for those every year, or are they given like for 3 years at a time, or how long do those things last?
Thank you, Karen. It really depends. It depends on the department. It depends on the grant. It depends on the grant funding source. So some are recurring that apply each year. For example, the juvenile drug court grant, but some are one time.
So in the budget detail, I got a printed version on page 118. It lists grants and donations. Maybe in the future, we could say which ones are 1 year and which ones are 2 year, maybe say the time frame in that description. Because I think that would be pertinent. I don't know. Then my second question is, there was some discussion in the news a couple of years back about the number of rape kits that are unprocessed. Do we have any of that in Washington County? And if so, how are we addressing that?
Karen, can you, you cut out or I cut out the number of what?
Rape kits. Rape kits that are unprocessed. There are other counties around us that maybe have some that are unprocessed, and that kind of hit the news. They're kind of heavy for a while.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm wondering what our status is and what we're doing to make sure we're keeping up.
Thank you for that question. I will go back to the subject matter experts and get some answers back to the committee.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Chair Harrington, go ahead. You're on double mute, Chair Harrington.
Thank you. I really appreciate how over the last couple of years, the budget has gotten increasingly more transparent about the challenges that we face, and there are a whole variety of them. I was wondering I have 3 questions. The first goes back to slide 33 and community corrections, where you talk about 10 positions that will not be filled. And I was trying to remember over the course of the different presentations that we've had from that department, there's a mix of reducing beds, reducing services, but I also know there's the challenge that with an incredibly lean organization, that if one of your colleagues for the next shift calls in sick, that requires, due to statutory requirements, requires someone to not end their shift, but to stay on for a second shift in a row, which in turn increases overtime and also makes it really hard for people to go on vacation, to get a break and get rest and rejuvenation. So I was wondering if we would be dealing with an exacerbation of those challenges as a result of not filling those 10 positions.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. It is a ongoing balance, and it won't be surprising to you to hear that part of what I talk with Director Berger and his team about is, especially as we analyze what positions are frozen, what can be released, what are, contributing to staff ratios, mandatory minimum ratios. That's kind of one element that you're touching on. The other one is sometimes a position has a cost, but it might cost more not to fill it, to your point around overtime, right? So there's that balance that we have to continue to work with the departments on to realize, reducing mandatory overtime actually sometimes saves you money. And then there's ratios, that's, staff client ratios that they need to be aware of. So we are looking at all of those factors when determining what those minimums are, what staff are going to be filled. The 10.5 positions here, like I mentioned, most are left over from last fiscal year cuts. But to your point as well, when you're looking at programming and services to the community, again, it's that balance of how much can you hold back and still deliver those services.
Yeah. I really appreciate how through these proposed budgets and strategic plans that the full board sees that each department is being very transparent about challenges. And unfortunately, we're having to work out solutions, and you and Ms. Angie and the department heads have worked out solutions that are, for lack of a better phrase, taking us in the wrong direction, right? We're not meeting community need. Rather, we're having to continue to make a really hard situation worse. It's been this way since the 3 of us joined on the commission in 2019. So I just don't want the moment to go by for our community members to think that this is lost. It's not lost on me anyway, as well as to our employees. So thank you.
Thank you.
The next question that I have is on juvenile, and I know I also have a question on conciliation, but I think that's slide 35. So I'm going to assume, since I didn't make note of it, that juvenile is on slide 34. Aha, yes, there we go. I was wondering, I really, really appreciate the budget committee sequencing and these overviews this year. Last year it was wonderful. We had much more community engagement through the public hearings than we had had any of the previous years that I've been on the commission. So I'm imagining that we might get some testimony about pulling back on community corrections, but also potentially on juvenile services. Really creative team here, but I'm wondering, with now that we have at least some of the 2020 census information, I was wondering if you could provide as part of the Q&A information a chart of the age demographic shifts over, you know, a 5-year period, because what I'm recalling is that we have and this is by virtue of the district attorney, Kevin Barton, highlighting it, that we have a growing population of children in our community. And so I'm just trying to gauge how our population demographics for the teenage years that would apply to juvenile may be changing over time. I just don't have a feel for that. I know what a positive impact these support services can have on those very young lives. So I'm just wondering if we could help not only ourselves on this budget committee, but also our community better understand those demographics.
Yeah, we can connect. I'll connect with juvenile, and they have the demographic on the total amount, youth population, and then the referrals over time. I think that's what you're asking. And then
yes, that sounds like it. Thanks, Erin.
Information. You bet.
Then the last one is on the next slide with conciliation services. A similar sort of trend, trying to better understand community need. I'm wondering if, you know, as Ms. Angie talked about, part of the budget challenge is access to justice, right? So with conciliation services, you did a very nice job of articulating how conciliation services help with divorce proceedings, and in lieu of more, I guess, I don't really have a nuanced way to say this, so more harsh conversations that don't necessarily help maintain relationships as needed for the benefit of the whole family unit. So I was wondering here as well, if you might have a way to illustrate demand. And it could be that we have to use a proxy of, you know, divorces over the course of time per capita or something. I don't mean to make up some indices. I'm just not that familiar with it. So it would help, I would think, as some of this service level is either funded through state funds or mandated through state funds or influenced, if we could have a way to help ourselves and our community members better understand these challenges that we're faced with when it comes to addressing their community needs. That's all.
Yep, I will get that data as well, and they will be able to talk with us about the services that, like the high conflict resolution class, some of the coursework I think you're alluding to on some of the effective practices that they're using.
Yeah, and just in closing, I want to say again, I really appreciate the problem solving that each of you have done to weigh all these different challenges, yet deliver to us a balanced proposed budget. I know it's really hard. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Willie?
Hi, yes, just kind of a short comment, but it's obvious to me that the common theme in all the messaging that you provided, Aaron, was that we have a state that is not willing to pay for the services that we provide that kind of are mandated on us. And so when you look at our justice court, our juvenile services, our law library, our conciliation services, I think we do a phenomenal job as a county, but our legislators don't advocate for full funding from our state. And I think that's going to have to be one of our top priorities for policies that we advocate to the state in the next legislative session that's coming up in 23. And so I just want to say, I think we're doing a phenomenal job with the money that we have, but we need to absolutely advocate that the state step up and pay for the services that we provide. So just my political comment. Good job tonight, Aaron. Thank you.
Do any other commissioners or budget committee members have questions for the Public Safety and Justice? Okay, seeing none, back to you, Chair Bolin.
Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the next functional area. Is that land use and transportation?
Yes, thank
Okay,
you.
so we're moving on to the next functional area presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Again, I'm Rachel Fuller, Assistant County Administrator. Land use and transportation includes a variety of divisions that work with residents to develop, build, and maintain the Washington County community. Next slide. County services included in the road fund include transportation operations, maintenance, traffic engineering, survey, and capital project delivery. The primary revenue source for this fund is state highway fund dollars that includes state gas tax, registration fees, license fees, and weight mile tax for large trucks. These revenues declined significantly in 2020 due to the COVID-19 shutdowns, but have since rebounded and stabilized. The budget estimates a 7% increase in revenue, consistent with state revenue forecasts for fiscal year 22-23. The state predicts revenue growth through 2025 and then a flattening of revenues thereafter. The flattening is due to higher gas prices that tend to result in lower gas tax revenue as people may drive less. It's good for the environment and traffic congestion, but hurts this revenue source. And the second factor is the phased implementation of increases in state gas tax, license fees, registration fees, and the weight mile tax as a result of House Bill 2017 and House Bill 3055. The final increases take effect in January 2024. Finally, the state revenue forecast includes disruptive climate events, such as flooding and wildfires that may be disruptive to people's travel habits. Several projects were placed on hold due to the initial decline in revenue from the pandemic, and it has taken some time to restart and move projects forward to construction. For fiscal year 22-23, capital expenditures total $17.1 million. And these include $5.6 million for accessibility improvements, curb ramps and pedestrian signals for ADA compliance, $6.6 million for Hag Lake Slide Repair Project. This is the last in a series of 3 significant repairs needed around the lake, and $5 million for pedestrian and biking improvements and design and construction of a rural bridge, Stringtown Road Bridge. Next slide. The Long Range Planning Division conducts community planning and transportation planning and is responsible for updates to the county's comprehensive plan and adherence to Oregon's land use laws. Major projects for fiscal year 22-23 include middle housing implementation. House Bill 2001 was passed in 2019 by the Oregon legislature and requires Washington County to allow housing types often referred to as middle housing, including duplexes, triplex, and fourplexes in residential zones. Other projects include the Major Streets Transportation Improvement Program, Tualatin Valley Highway Transit Planning, short-term rental regulations, and support for regional affordable housing and parks and trails bond implementation. The program is supported through lottery fund dollars and the general fund. Current and/or development planning includes services such as review and processing of land development requests, ensures land use code compliance, and provides information and assistance to community members regarding property development within the urban, unincorporated, and rural areas, approximately 240,000. Building services include full service permitting and inspection programs to urban, unincorporated, and rural areas, plus Banks, Gaston, and North Plains. This includes residential and commercial building plan review, permitting, inspections in electrical, plumbing, mechanical, and fire systems. This graph of case files accepted and contacts in current planning illustrate a tension in current planning and building services. Blue bars are total case files accepted. And you can see that these have declined over several years, while total contacts have remained the same. What this shows us is that public and customer service demands have stayed the same, while fee-generating development activity has decreased. Both of these work groups, current planning and building services, are funded by fees for service, except for a $325,000 general fund subsidy to current planning for code compliance. Relatively higher fees for large developments have traditionally helped offset lower fees for smaller developments and non-fee generating services. As the amount and scope of development activity has decreased, it is challenging to fund these services from fees alone, even with a recommended fee increase in both service areas. A consultant has been engaged to deliver an assessment and recommendations for building services and current planning. Preliminary findings and recommendations are anticipated summer 2022. And in the meantime, the fiscal year 22-23 budget maintains service levels. Next slide. Land use and transportation has budgeted more than $230,000 for community engagement and equity consultation for the Major Streets Transportation Improvement Program and middle housing efforts. All consultants on this effort are disadvantaged business enterprise firms. A portion of this funding is available to compensate community members for their participation. Across the department, approximately $20,500 is budgeted for translation, interpretation, and accommodation. $50,000 is budgeted for staff training and development opportunities. In addition, land use and transportation plans to fund and fill 2 newly created department-wide positions, an equity policy coordinator and a community outreach specialist, to improve the department's outreach and help LUT improve efforts to identify and address inequities that may exist in programs and services. This is funded by land use and transportation, but will work collaboratively with OEICE, the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. Finally, the expenditures mentioned earlier for traffic signals and pedestrian push buttons are retrofits for compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Locations are prioritized by request in coordination with the Commission for the Blind and in conjunction with ADA ramps and paving. I'll turn it over. Happy to answer any questions.
Commissioner Rogers.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. What percentage of the land use and transportation budget is funded by the general fund? You had a quick slide up there, and how does that compare to other counties? It appears to me that we're not funding a lot of things out of the general fund as other cities and counties do, for instance, in the planning area, code enforcement, et cetera. We, for many, many years, have been able to subsidize all these areas with fees coming off of development, but that's slowed. So tell me how, in your opinion, your professional opinion, this all works in the future without significant infusion of general fund monies. And that's going to exasperate, obviously, the $30 million backfill that and we're going to have to do from some other sources. I certainly understand the Oregon statutes under 294 and what the requirements are, practicing it all the time. So I use the term deficit, but that's not a good term, but it certainly gets the point across that we're going to have to come up with dollars. So tell me how this is going to work in the future. Are you going to continue to either one, not do code enforcement, not do planning on a broad scale, or is the general fund going to have to subsidize that in some way, which is going to exasperate the amount of money that's going to be a shortfall that's going to have to be made up from other funds or other areas?
Thank you for that question, Commissioner Rogers. We would have to look at how other counties specifically fund to really compare to Washington County. So we can certainly bring back some information for the committee at a future date. But you are correct. The fees for current planning and building are not adequate to fund these services with fees alone. So that is the purpose of the assessment that will analyze what is happening, what that tension is within those services, and present some recommendations for staff to consider moving forward. With regards to long range planning, there are several general fund sources that provide support to long range planning, so that is another one that, as the county looks at what services it will provide into the future, those factors will absolutely need to be taken into consideration.
Chair Harrington.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. I appreciate the explanation that you've provided to Commissioner Rogers. And I think we're all looking forward to the report out from that assessment that's been underway to help shed some light on that. I was wondering, for this specific slide, if you could clarify for us what portions of perhaps the road fund, building services, current planning, and long-range planning are unique to the size and needs of the urban unincorporated areas. Well, let me step back. It isn't so much that I'm looking for any qualification or quantification, but rather to just get confirmation whether or not those particular areas apply because of the large nature. We're the county with the largest urban unincorporated area in the whole state. And so I'm wondering, of these different areas, what exists, just because we're counties and all counties have responsibilities with regard to rural lands, but what about those urban unincorporated areas? and the fact that the extent of them is so unique here in Washington County. Could you comment on that?
Thank you, Chair Harrington. That is an excellent question. And it is a question that I'm going to need to go back and consult with the department about. I don't have the answer for that for you today, but we can certainly get that question answered, or at least attempt an answer to that question for you.
And it's not that I need the answer absolutely for this year's proposed budget, but I do think as we move forward with that study and ensure that our community has transparency there to understand that, that we answer that question at least then. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It is an excellent question. So thank you for raising it.
And if I may add, Ms. Fuller and Chair Harrington, in our answer, we will also provide what's also maybe not known by the community is that we actually deliver building services for some of our incorporated areas. And so that will also be included in that answer that we follow up with.
Do any other budget committee members have any questions on the land use and transportation section? Okay, back over to you, Chair Bolin.
So it looks like now we're on to our community input. So I guess the floor is open. We have some participants that are on this call, I believe. And so now there are some emailed questions and there are some voices that we're going to hear from. Is that correct?
So yes, Chair Bolin. So now is the time for public communication on this portion of part 1 of the budget. So if any members of the public wish to provide comment for up to 2 minutes, please utilize the raise hand function. Give you just a moment if anyone has any questions.
So the floor is open for community comments.
All right, we have one hand so far. Melissa Laird, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Great, thanks a lot. So when we were talking about the public safety and justice, there was a lot of discussions on positions and people. And so I was trying to get my hands around what's the implication of personnel with respect to this department. And so looking on pages 48 and 49, which is a list of the frozen and cut positions, it looks to be that the number of positions that are being frozen and cut is not equitable across the different departments, and actually quite heavily is in the safety and justice, public safety and justice area. So 40% of the cuts are in those areas. 26% is in the sheriff's office with 17 people, and 14% is in the DA office with 9 people. So that's 40% of the cuts are in our safety, in keeping us safe. So this, when I look at this in just in general, it kind of looks to be a bit of a defunding of the police and the district attorney. And so I'm wondering if that's truly the case and the implications of that. I do know that it takes time and effort to hire and train officers, law enforcement, deputies, and if we put them on hold or cut them, it's going to be at least probably a 2-year cycle before we can get them back up and running. So that the impact of that is not only just short-term, but long-term. And also if some of this has to do with the response times for emergencies, are these cuts going to actually cause response times to get longer for us? And are we going to be looking at some of the things like we see in Portland? And also we have a pretty unique, just a kind of side comment to that, we have a unique situation here in Washington County where our patrol and probation officers do not carry guns. And they're only one of 2 counties who do that. And the reason that they don't is because they have robust sheriff support. They know if they need to, that the sheriff will be there to respond. If the sheriff's not going to be there, response times are longer. Like all of us, they'll be more in danger and may have to have personal protection. So, more costs for those officers because they're going to have to protect themselves. So I'm just worried about looking at the positions and the personnel relative to our safety. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else?
I do not see any additional hands raised. Is there any other members of the public that wish to provide comment tonight? Not seeing any additional hands, Chair Boland.
So then, just for the good of the order, could you explain how Melissa's concerns would be addressed so she understands? Would that be at the next meeting, or how will she get a response?
Chair Boland, we will be compiling the questions and providing answers in written format to the committee. Those will be posted on the county's website for full transparency. Since we don't have any additional speakers, let me kind of respond to the frozen list that Ms. Laird had referred to on page 48. So the frozen list was a point in time list when we were balancing the budget. I will say that is not even the accurate list, because we've had further attrition within the organization. What we are focused on in the proposed budget is managing to a $3.7 million reduction in personnel cost within the general fund. The reason this is the list and these positions were taken, I will call out of the budget, is our current financial system does not allow us to budget to a zero. The reason they are reflected on this list is we fully recognize that we have some critical positions on this list that will need to be filled as we experience general attrition within the organization. We have a cross-departmental staff team, which is led by Assistant County Administrator Erin Calvert, who is working on developing a clear criteria of what positions will be released. Further information will be available to the committee as we enter into public hearing time for the Budget Committee's orientation and understanding of what that criteria will be and how we will unfreeze positions and manage our budget to a 3.7 salary savings.
Thank you. So those responses will be available by Thursday? No.
We may not have all responses on Thursday. They will for sure be available by this Budget Committee's public hearing, which is on Mr. Rhodes.
June 1st?
June 2nd.
Thank you.
June 1st, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, got it. All right. All right, so that sounds good. All right, so no other community comments that we're aware of?
That is correct, Chair Boland, and Chair Harrington has her hand raised.
Oh, good. All right. Chair Harrington.
Well, two things. The budget public hearing for the Washington County Budget and Service District for lighting is Thursday, June 2nd. In the schedule, the one on Wednesday, June 1st is on ESPD, URMD, and North Bethany, if I understood the schedule, the published schedule correctly. Or do you want people to come and testify both nights?
The public is more than welcome to come and testify on any part of the budget on those nights. But we are focusing on, you're absolutely right, the county budget on June the 2nd for those that want to comment on the county budget.
And is that going to be an in-person meeting or still Zoom?
Still Zoom.
Still Zoom, okay.
Yeah, but the reason I raised my hand was to just get a clarification on the question or the comment. In one portion of tonight's presentation, it talked about how the Census 2020 information provided a correction, so to speak, or a ground truthing population forecast compared to a population forecast that had been a basis for the public safety levy and maybe ESPD staffing. So does that that freeze list, as we're referring to it, is that independent of that list and also of Ms. Laird's comments?
I would ask Ms. Calvert respond to that question.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Angie. Chair Harrington, I think what you're asking is the difference of the special funds and general funds, right? Yes. So we are trying to sort all of that out. Right now, everything is sort of on a freeze because, as we know, sometimes special funds have an impact on the general fund. And so it's not quite as easy or black and white to say, you know, special fund bucket, general fund bucket, but we're trying to tease that out as quickly as we can so that we're not holding up positions that don't impact the general fund, but also trying to look at it through that one Washington County lens of what's best for the organization, knowing we have limited and strained resources.
Okay, are we ready to move on? Any other questions? Roy Rogers, you have a question?
Sure. Yeah, real quickly for maybe more for Tanya than anybody. I've tried to tease out a few of the issues. There's many more, but a few of the issues that have to do with decision points that I think the budget committee needs to be involved with. We certainly can do it at the board level, but at what point, if any, are we going to simply accept the information that you've submitted and said, great, let's worry about some of this in the future? Or are there any decision points that you feel are there that our 5-member budget committee, non-board, have been asked to participate in that they will have some input on? Is there any policy, and I understand the board sets a policy, that you want their input at all on during these budget meetings?
That's a great question, Commissioner Rogers. And as staff have indicated throughout this presentation, we are actively working on developing the criteria for we'll call it unfreezing of positions and freezing of additional positions, so we can manage to a net reduction of 3.7 for this upcoming fiscal year. I think I, along with the team, would value tremendously from the budget committee's input on that criteria. And I believe, Ms. Calvert, we can be ready by the public hearing to ensure that the committee has input on that criteria. I will say from a workforce standpoint, managing this budget situation to a freeze is far less disruptive to our workforce than looking at layoffs, looking at furloughs, or looking at wage reductions. So I do want to underscore, I understand, we really understand the challenges this puts our departments in, and are also looking at stabilizing and, frankly, retaining the workforce we have. And so that's the challenge we're in, given our current financial position. I hope that answers your question. So the criteria would be helpful for the committee to weigh in as we get to the public hearing.
So that's the only decision point that you, I'm not pushing back, I'm just curious. Mm-hmm. So the only decision point that you want them to be involved with is exactly the issue you just mentioned, of a zero sum. So we're not laying off anybody or reducing salaries, and I get that. But are there, in your mind, any other decision points that this budget committee is going to make, other than thanking all of you for putting together a good document and pointing out that there are some issues? Is there any other input points?
Well, I think, Commissioner Rogers, I think concerns on financial direction, concerns on service level, that is going to be incredibly helpful for staff to hear, because as Mr. Rhodes has indicated, this is not a one-year budget situation. We are, in essence, after this budget is adopted, we are hitting the ground running already into the following year, so that we can have come back to your budget committee, your board, with further discussion on a financial sustainability plan. So if there are aspects of financial sustainability plan, this budget committee and your expertise would suggest that we pursue, absolutely open to that as well. And I would like to take the time to consult with the team and see how I can more robustly answer that question, but those are on the top of my head, Commissioner Rogers.
Okay, so any other community members have raised their hand that we're aware of, Mr. Moss?
No, there is not.
Okay, so are we ready to move on? Any other comments or questions? So it looks like we're at the end of our meeting for today, and we will reconvene on May 12th at 5:30 using Zoom. And we'll have some more presentations for consideration prior to our public hearing on June 1st for this, 1st and 2nd, I guess.
Chair
So,
Boland,
yes.
if I may, earlier on in the meeting, we talked about the potential for a additional discussion and deliberation meeting on the 31st. I guess the question before the committee today is, would there be a desire to make that decision this evening, or would you like to take a few days to ponder that and take it back up on the 12th when we meet Thursday evening for part 2?
So the 2 lay members are Joe, Ross, and myself. Is that correct?
And Mr. Lathrop.
Oh, yes. Okay. So my thought would be, from the 3 of us, do we feel like we need to have an additional discussion? Is that? So I don't know, Joe, and the other person, was it Paul?
Yeah, being new, I'm going to kind of draft off of you, to be quite honest. I'll see how the May 12th presentation goes, but things seem to be moving along smoothly.
Okay. So we wouldn't need an additional time, in your opinion?
Unless things seem to slow down or we get bogged down on anything, I'm not sure if it's needed.
Okay. And then the other person was?
Paul Lathrop.
Paul, do you feel like you need additional time on the 31st? Is Paul still with us? Okay. So I see hands up by Jerry Willie. Do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to think that maybe we could reserve the 31st, but actually hit the pause button on this until our next meeting. If we run into issues or we need to continue at that point in time, then we could do that. But I'd like to think we could wrap this up in the next meeting.
Agreed. Okay. Catherine Harrington, comment?
Thank you, Budget Chair. I wondered a couple of things. I'm just recognizing to your question on the potential for an additional meeting on May 31st. What's different this year compared to all the other years is having this public comment period. And it's an experiment. So we had no idea how many people would turn up and ask questions or make comment. And we still don't know how many we might get on May 12th. But I think we have at least a data point now. And I was also concerned that in advance of actually going through this, that we might have more questions about how the budget equity tool was used, or further discussion on the challenges. So from my standpoint, tonight has gone really swiftly. So I'm pretty pleased about that. The second question I had was to ask, I think similarly last year, Jennifer Berghardt, her attendance was a little spotty. And so I'm wondering if our Washington County staff team had followed up with each of these community members to find out if they were actually planning to serve on the committee this year or not. Because it seems to me like that just having 2 members not be here at all affects the effectiveness of having a fully staffed budget committee meeting. So maybe we should have done a better job in appointing alternates, and then whoever shows up actually serves that evening. I don't know. Just what do you think?
So I spoke with Jennifer. I believe she moved out of state. And I think I was under the impression she had sent Jack Lang a resignation letter, but maybe nothing with that transition, maybe nothing happened.
Yeah, I will say that we did put out an all call. We did just find out about the resignation piece, but we did put out an all call for applicants. We did receive those applicants and went through the interview process. So we did I think as good a job as we could have to get through the application process and the interview process and make the recommendation to the board. And we hope that we will have going forward the full complement of the board members as we go forward.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So hearing all of that, I like the idea of reserving the 31st, but let's get through the meeting on the 12th and see if the 31st is needed. Does that sound agreeable? Just by consensus, I'm seeing nods. So given that, I guess, are we ready to adjourn to the 12th? Do we need a motion on adjournment?
Since we've already, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
All right. Since you've already noticed it, you just would adjourn this meeting and just say the next meeting's on the 12th.
Okay, I saw Pam raise a hand. Any last comments?
I was just going to move, but it doesn't sound like we need to.
Okay. So I will officially adjourn our meeting for tonight, and we will reconvene on May 12th for some additional presentations on the other functional areas that were not presented tonight. And I hope that the community will join us and ask more questions. So thank you to all of the staff who've done a nice job preparing this, and we appreciate all your work, and we'll see you on Thursday. Meeting adjourned.